Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. Since our last episode, a new conflict has begun in Iran with ramifications not only for the broader Middle East, but for the entire world. We are very fortunate that today's interview, which we recorded just hours before the first bombs fell on Tehran, is with a guest who is deeply expert on the roots of the conflict. Guardian journalist Jason Burke has reported from Middle East conflict zones for over 30 years, and he is also the author of the hugely successful 2025 book, The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s. The book provides an unprecedented account of a period which definitively shaped today's world and probes the complex relationship between violence, terrorism, and revolution. The book was shortlisted for the 2025 Ballie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction, with the prize committee calling the book, quote, a sweeping, scrupulously reported historical narrative with the pace and suspense of a thriller, end quote. The Revolutionists also featured on the best of 2025 lists for the Financial Times, The Economist, The Guardian, and BBC History. Of course, if you enjoyed this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. We are pleased to welcome Jason Burke to Earlylands in Conversation. Jason, thank you very much for joining us today. I know your schedule is very packed, but let's jump right into it. But first of all, I should ask, where are we catching you at? You're in the UK, but probably heading to the Middle East very soon.
I'm in London with my bags packed and waiting to hear from my editors if I'm traveling to the Middle East now or in a few days, or perhaps not at all. But I think that is an unlikely scenario. I'm probably going to be there at some stage pretty soon again.
This will be interesting to listen to, and I think we're going to post it in about 10 days' time, right? So who knows what happens in the next 10 days. So
Indeed.
for
Who
our
knows?
listeners, the arc of history. Speaking of the arc, let's talk a little bit before we jump into about the book. You spent nearly 30 years as a foreign correspondent, Afghanistan, Middle East, Africa, South Asia. Take us back to the beginning. What drew you into journalism, and how did the question of political violence and terrorism become really an organizing thread for your professional life?
I became interested in journalism very early in my teens, and I think it is something that just allowed me to do all the things that I'm interested in.
Sure.
Travel was something that I always wanted to do, particularly in rougher places of the world. I used to do a lot of mountaineering and skiing
Right.
and that sort of thing. And so this was a way of getting to places and having someone else pay for it, which was always an attraction. Then there's the it's a cliche, but the front row of history stuff. I mean, you get to
Sure.
see
First
amazing things
draft of history,
happening.
right?
Yeah. And history was another one of my great passions. That's what I studied at university and so forth. I didn't want to be a historian. It was too much time in lecture halls and archives, but I was really interested in events. I still am interested in history more broadly. And so in a sense, this was a current contemporary history that I could see happening, that I could be part of, or at least witness. And I think finally, and that speaks to your last question, which is a good one, is that I'm deeply interested in people and what makes people do things. I mean, that was one of the reasons I was interested in history. And what I saw and have seen is a lot of violence. And I'm interested in how societies and communities become involved in violence, create violent individuals, or how violent individuals indeed create and influence societies. So, I mean, you put it all together and you kind of end up in one specific place. And I've been very lucky in my career to be able to find newspapers who employ me to do that. And also at a time, political, religious, and other violence is always an issue. But
Sure.
the last 20, 30 years has been a particular period where that kind of violence, particularly on an individual level, has been much more prominent, perhaps, than it has been in some previous periods.
You've now written 5 books alongside this daily, I don't know, grind, I would say, but, just the daily journey of reporting for The Guardian. There's a discipline and a different kind of intellectual commitment that goes into a book, of course, for, say, 750-word article. How do you think about the relationship between the two? Your book reads, it's such a strong narrative verve to it. It's unputdownable, to use that cliche, but an academic history often is put downable, I would say. So where
Yeah.
do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, academic histories don't have to be put downable. It's just that historians
Right,
don't usually have the writing chops. But and these days it's much harder to get away with. I mean, in the
right.
era of Netflix and Instagram and YouTube and
Yeah,
also
you better have a hook, right?
a lot of great nonfiction writing. I mean, you've got to make it an experience. You've got to, you can't make it hard work. I mean, I now put down books that I get sort of 30 pages into and just think this, I should read this,
Right, right. You feel
but
like
I
I
just,
need to be
there's
able
so
to
much.
say I finished it.
Yeah. So I think, nonfiction writing has had to really raise its game. In the last decade or so. So essentially, I have no choice. And yeah, I mean, I think they're different muscles, the daily reporting and writing books. I mean, they're different disciplines, but I like shifting from one to the other. I get slightly tired of just the rapidity, the extremely kinetic nature of modern news reporting. So writing books is a very fulfilling alternative to that because it is a much bigger canvas. Obviously, you're organizing material in a much grander way. And also you're working to your own timeline very often,
Right, right.
and that is great. On the other hand, it can be very isolating, and you can disappear into a black hole of
Down the rabbit hole of
yeah,
yeah,
especially if you've got no immediate deadlines, and that can be quite alienating in some ways, or I find it quite a lonely
sure.
experience. So I like going back into the kind of hustle and bustle of a newsroom and the news world after a
Right,
period in the ivory tower of tapping away at
right,
books to
right.
mix
Going
various
deep into
metaphors.
early Palestinian nationalism, right? Or
But
it's
that's where there's a crossover. I mean,
sure,
so one of the great things about writing this book was the last, I mean, I started it a long time ago, but the last few years I was writing about Palestinian nationalism uh, for the book and also obviously for the newspaper because I was
of
covering
course.
the war in Gaza. So there was definite um, coincidence in terms of material there, and one very much informed the other. I mean, you're talking about kind of whether you're a journalist or a historian, or whether you're kind of doing both. And certainly, my techniques, both in terms of writing and in terms of research, are very heavily informed by my
Sure.
reporting.
Sure. I mean, no doubt being able to go so deep into the life story of early Palestinian nationalists would certainly inform your reporting, right? How you looked at the current
Well,
crop of leaders of Hamas or and
absolutely,
such.
yeah,
Yeah.
and the deep roots of their ideology as well. And
Right.
and I obviously went to find these people. A lot of these people and spent time in the occupied West Bank and elsewhere in the region, tracking down people who had been involved in armed Palestinian activism in the 70s. And that is something that a journalist does, go and
Sure.
talk to people,
Right.
and a historian doesn't necessarily.
We should talk about the book, of course. So, The Revolutionists is in many ways the culmination of this career I've spent studying political violence. What was the intellectual question that made you think that the 1970s in particular needed its own full treatment? And what were you trying to understand that maybe your previous either books or your journalism hadn't covered?
So the book came out of an earlier book project, which was in about 2014 or 15. I was commissioned to write about ISIS. And I looked at a kind of survey of ISIS activities at the time. That didn't really seem very interesting. Lots to say, but most of it had been said before and by
Sure.
others who knew more about it than me. So I ended up writing something that was a kind of brief history of Islamic militancy to that point and showing how ISIS came out of something much broader and deeper. That didn't really work either as a book. So I dumped the draft, and I wrote another one. Um, that did work. But that had taken me to a really interesting place, and the place it took me to was the late 60s and 1970s. Um, and I got there partly because it's in 80s, which is usually seen as where modern Islamic extremism
Right.
originates in the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan and so forth, has been very well explored. And I was suddenly taken by the idea of writing the prequel, effectively. So I was looking at the 70s and I was looking at the early 60s, and various things struck me. One was that the roots of Islamic militancy in the 60s seem to be quite evident, the mid to late 60s. So you have a key ideologue, Said Qutb, who was hanged in 66 in in Egypt, and that's a seminal moment. You have the 1967 war. You have much else that's happening in the Middle East at the time, and that's where the modern Islamist resurgence begins.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me was that it tied into something else that had long interested me, which is that earlier wave of international terrorism that is very well known, spectacularly treated in huge numbers of films and
Right. Right. Of
books and
course.
so forth. And there was more about the 1960s, late 60s and 70s that interested me because the roots of the Islamism were one thing, but it tied in to another project that I'd been really interested in for a long time. And that was having a really good look at that earlier wave of international terrorism that is really well known. Like spectacular attacks like the hijacking that led to the Israeli raid on Entebbe in 1976, the 1972 attack on the Munich Olympics, like numerous other incidents that are really well known, and people who are really well known, most notably Carlos the Jackal or Leyla Khalid. And these people were, iconic. Anyone who was interested in political violence knows about them. But they and those events had received very little attention since really the 90s. And we'd been looking elsewhere. So I thought it would be very interesting to go back, look at those people, look at those events with a completely fresh perspective, lots of new sources, find those people, get them to
Right.
talk about what they've done, and then run that in parallel with an exploration of the early roots of Islamism, because it was the same period. We're
Right.
talking late 60s, a time of great global ferment, protest movements everywhere across the West and elsewhere, cultural revolution in China, all sorts of things on in the developing world, and put it all together into one pretty epic narrative.
So let's talk about the central thesis. So the core argument of the book, as at least as I understood it, is that a campaign of secular leftist revolutionary violence, Carlos the Jackal, the Bader Meinhof gang, the Japanese Red Army, gave way by the early 1980s to something qualitatively more lethal, and that was conservative religious fanaticism. Walk us through that transition.
Yeah, okay, so it's on two parallels, and I mean, well, the on two tracks, if you like. So, and one doesn't lead neatly to the other. What happens is one fades out and the other gets stronger.
Right,
And
right,
some people have slightly misrepresented what I'm saying in that they seem to be arguing that the leftism led inexorably to radical Islam, which I'm not saying at all. All I'm saying is that one was influenced by the other. So the argument of the book is quite simple in a sense. Terrorism is only used to achieve certain goals. It's not very rarely an end in itself. Those goals come out of a desire among individuals or a community or whatever to change things, to redress
right.
certain
Of
grievances.
course.
If those aren't redressed and those terrorists are eliminated one way or another, then it's unlikely that terrorism will go away as a problem. You'll just get a different manifestation of terrorism. And so you see that quite clearly in the Middle East, where you have in the late 60s, right through the mid 70s, a wave of nationalist, secular, left leaning, progressive, broadly, actors who are using terrorism, or at least some of them are, as a tactic. And they are destroyed, scattered, dispersed, exiled, arrested, tortured, whatever, and fail. They also make lots of mistakes themselves, and they never really connect with a mass mobilized constituency. And there's lots of internecine infighting that weakens them very considerably. But by the end of the decade, they're barely a force.
Right.
But what you do have is an alternative, which is Islamism, which also looks to bring about revolutionary change and looks to do it often through violence and through mass mobilization. And that provides a new template, which is attractive to a new wave of activists, and indeed a few of the older ones too. And that becomes the new vehicle for all those aspirations for radical change. Now, that seems to me to be fairly self evident, but it's an argument that has been largely forgotten in many quarters, particularly since 9/11, but even well before. One of the ways you can see that, if you like, in terms of evidence, is if you compare what happens in the Middle East with what happens in the West. And in the West, you have a similar very broad mobilization, of which there is a fringe that becomes very violent. And it lasts a few years, and it fades away. And it fades away partly because governments get better at fighting it through legal means, on the whole, some of dubious constitutionality, depending on the jurisdiction, but generally staying within the law. And because they make concessions, in a sense, they make concessions to the broader movement
Sure.
that led to the fringe coming through as violent. So in the West, you get lots of new legislation that gives women better reproductive rights or control over their own bodies. You get funding of further education, which was one of the big flashpoints and grievances for young people. You get lowering voting rights. You get all sorts of social changes and political changes, which answer many of the pretty legitimate demands made by the 60s protesters and young people in that period. And so the violence ebbs. There's still lots of terrorism, but it tends not to be revolutionary. It's not aiming at massive, radical change.
Sort of structural change, right?
Yeah, it's not. I mean, you have IRA and you have ETA and you have Puerto Ricans blowing things up in the US. You have all sorts of things going on, but it's not on this kind of global scale. And the contrast between the two is really interesting. And it seems to show or suggest that there are ways to deal with terrorism particularly within a liberal democratic system, which can be successful. And straight repression, the idea that you can just kill your way out of the
Right.
problem, is a falsehood.
So the book is just an encyclopedia of fascinating characters, but who got under your skin the most? Who really did you find to be the most intriguing, the most vexing, and the most frustrating?
I mean, they had lots. So one of the things that was fun about it was discovering, and important, I think, about it was discovering real depth to characters that have otherwise been misrepresented. So there was one individual called Mohammed Boudia who has always just been depicted as a, quotes, womanizer and
Right.
terrorist, end quotes. And he was both, to be fair. But he was also a playwright of some renown. He was the first man to translate Molière from French to Arabic. He ran experimental theatres. He was involved in the anti-colonial struggle in the Algerian War of Independence against the French. Um, and was a much broader and deeper individual than simply a womanizer and a terrorist. He was killed by the Mossad in 1973 in Paris. Learning about him just gave things a little bit more breadth in terms of understanding quite what was happening at the time and out of what culture and networks these people were emerging. So those kind of people were interesting and revealing. Um, it didn't make me more sympathetic towards what they were doing, but
Sure.
it did help explain it. Two people who were frustrating and in some ways deeply repellent, but in other ways quite attractive, were Ulrike Meinhof and Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, who is better known as Carlos the Jackal. Um, there are lots of others I could mention, but those two, I mean, there's nothing really attractive about Carlos, although he wants it to be. I got in touch with him in prison. We had this weird correspondence by letter, and he's very, very charming and very seductive,
How
actually.
old is he now?
He's in his late 70s, early 80s.
Right.
He's not doing well either, actually. But he was fascinating because he could never really exist in any other era in the way that he did. I mean, he's a sociopath, possibly a psychopath. I mean, he's interested only in his own well-being and his own myth. But what was interesting about him is that he was not a very good actual terrorist. He was quite
Mhm.
bad at doing the terrorism. But he was very good at two other things. And one was building relationships, which is essential in that world,
Right.
terrorism being a social activity. And the other was recognizing the power of celebrity and his own celebrity and using it. And that was an important thing to show in the book. Ulrike Meinhof was really interesting. She was one of the founders of the Red Army faction in Germany, West Germany then, the best known of the various West German radical groups, one of the most violent. She committed suicide in prison in 76, was active with the Red Army underground from 1972. She was amazing. She was a very prominent, very well-known left-wing journalist, highly intelligent, very articulate on all the local talk shows on German TV and so forth, discussing important social problems and writing essays. And she had a column in a
Right.
left-wing newspaper.
Proper public intellectual, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in a split second, pretty much, she made crucial decision, which meant that she ended up um, as one of the senior leaders of the what was then, or some called the Baader-Meinhof gang, after her and Andreas Baader, who was the man who was supposedly its leader. And her journey from mum of two, public left-wing intellectual, to being a wanted criminal who was behind bomb attacks that caused very considerable damage and casualties, is a fascinating story, and one that speaks to a lot of things in our own world and a lot of impulses that some might even have today, and was very much worth putting in the book, I think.
What surprised you the most in your research? I mean, you drew on declassified archives, secret documents, interviews, as you discussed with Carlos and myriad others. What surprised you?
I thought I knew them. I really didn't, though, because I was still, I mean, everything I'd read had been, and there was some very good work done, particularly in the 90s, but most of the literature, most of the representations are pretty schematic. One of the things that I was surprised by was the attitude of the Soviets to it all, which was very wary.
Right, right,
They were deeply concerned that these actors could cause them huge problems, could
right. That they
spark
were
a.
a bit of a wild dog on a chain sort of thing, right?
Absolutely, yeah, and they described them as adventurists. So that was interesting. I mean, I was surprised by loads of things, actually. The degree, I think the biggest was the degree to which these people, particularly on the left, really believed they could change the world. I mean, it's such a difference with our own very sort of cynical
Indeed.
world today, and that nobody's going around actually believing that they, as an individual, can make a massive difference and structurally change or contribute to the structural change of pretty much everything on the planet. And they really did. I mean, that kind of idealism was very present. I mean, it doesn't excuse what they did, as I say. And I was very careful in the book not to lapse into sort of sentimental,
Sure.
romantic rubbish about how, what they did in the end, in every case, was sordid, squalid, very unpleasant, caused a massive suffering to lots of people, often very undeserving people too. And I brought that out in the book. But the fact that they could talk about revolution in the way that they talked about it was something that was striking.
That naivety, I guess, but or
Yeah,
maybe
well,
that
we
again,
call
that's
it.
the cynicism you describe, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we call it naivety. I mean, yeah, but whether whether it was naive or not, I mean, that they thought they could change
They
the world.
truly believed it, right? Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
you make an interesting observation in the book that there was an enormous rhetorical and aspirational solidarity across these secular revolutionary movements in the 70s. But then in practice, the organization, they had divergent agendas, different cultural approaches of, how do you use women or not, and ways of working. And they rarely collaborated effectively. Tell us more about that.
This is a good thing to dig into because there'd been some, again, misunderstanding of this. There was almost no contact between Western leftists and the Islamists. In fact, there was none as far as I know. Where there was contact was between Western leftists and Middle Eastern broadly leftists. I mean, actually, this is where things got tricky because in the Middle East, a lot of the organizations might well have talked the talk of progressive
Right. Right.
values and socialism and the global struggle against imperialism, capitalism, and Zionism. But when it actually came to it on the ground, they were very locally rooted, as they had to be successful, and reflected local customs and values and ideas that were norms that were really pretty much at odds with those of a squat in Berlin or
Right.
a
Right.
commune in Paris or whatever it was. And so that led to friction and tensions, most famously when the West German Red Army faction, including Ulrich Meinhof, turns up in a PLO training camp in Jordan in 1970, and there are clashes immediately with the camp commander, who is a kind of crusty veteran of the Algerian war against the French. And the Germans want to sort of sunbathe topless and sleep together and drink and stuff. And that's obviously completely forbidden and absolutely shocking to their hosts.
The
And so that
class of
leads to much.
civilization, so to speak, in a different way.
Well, yeah, and then you read what the Germans are. I mean, none of them speak Arabic. None of them have been in the Middle East before, and they're writing home these. I found some of these little letters and so forth, and they're saying things like, "Oh, it's like being in the Arabian Nights." I mean, the kind of like classic Orientalist tropes. And so both sides are sort of talking past each other, even though they all kind of nod and agree when it comes to sticking it to the US or whatever. And so and then you do get a lot of rhetoric, but the actual examples of successful collaboration are minimal. I mean, they all love Che Guevara, but when it actually comes to putting his ideas into practice on the ground, a T-shirt only takes you so far
Yeah,
poster.
dorm room poster, right?
Yeah, and they
Yeah,
all have them. Absolutely, definitely.
of course.
And
Well,
I've
so
seen all these pictures. It's great.
that goes into another question I wanted to talk about was the role of new media technology, particularly television. And it seemed, and I think it was the intention, that these groups were engineering spectacles for television in ways that really hadn't been possible before. Dawson's Field, Munich, the Iranian embassy siege. How conscious were they of the media dimension?
Very. I
Yeah,
mean, this is, as very good commentator Brian Jenkins said in 1975, terrorists, sorry, wanted a lot of people watching and not a lot of people dead. I mean, it was very performative. It was designed for TV. And we can see that because we have internal memos and my own conversations with people and their own statements subsequently about decision making that was almost purely based on the degree of media attention they would get. Expressions of disappointment when their latest hijacking is overshadowed by the moon landings, for
right,
example. Or you get instances where, even early on, there are photographers being dispatched to the site of hijackings before they've happened. Part of the team there's a photographer that's been kind of deputed to go and cover this. Or you mentioned Dawson's Field, which is the September's 1970, when the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine tried to take 5 planes, ended up with 3 on a makeshift airstrip in Jordan. And with their passengers, but were careful to get all the passengers off, and then invited cameramen come and, well, held a series of press conferences there, actually, very bringing up all the
right,
cameras from Amman, which was the capital of Jordan. It's about 25 kilometers away. And then very specifically designed a scene where they would blow up the
right,
3 aircraft and made sure that there were cameramen there to film it. And yeah, and that had the impact it had, because that footage was on TVs in virtually every US living room within 36 hours. And just 2 years later than that, you get these live feeds from the Munich Olympics, which was a target specifically selected because massive media attention was guaranteed. The world's media would obviously be there. It's the Olympics. And there you get live feeds for the first time of an ongoing, in this case, hostage crisis, which was completely unprecedented. And as is always the case, those using the tactic of terrorism were much quicker to
sure,
understand the potential of this new technology, much quicker than the governments or the
right,
broadcasters, actually.
right, right. Well, let's talk about this bridge to the present, the extremism that so many of us are familiar with, aka what came with 9/11 and thereafter. Osama bin Laden appears in the book as sort of the connective tissue between 1970s world that you just described and then what followed, what I think so many of us are aware of. You quote a line that gets to the core of the argument that communism offered social justice but ignored identity, while political Islam offered both. Help us understand that sort of transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well done for focusing on that line, because it does in many ways hold, in some ways, the intellectual key to the book. I mean, so one of the things that's important is that you can see from the social profiles of people in, say, Egypt or Iran, that those on the left are almost identical to those on the right in many ways.
Right,
Not all. I mean, there are nuances in Iran and so forth, but you're talking about, on the whole, young people, educated people who are committed to radical activism in the search of a revolution, a
right,
socially, politically, culturally, and otherwise transformative event. And so the left fails in the Middle East, and it fails for a number of reasons, partly because of repression. One is or among the biggest, is that the left has a real problem with what would now be called kind of authenticity, I suppose. And there's this fantastic bit of research from 1981 among Egyptian Islamists, a whole load of interviews done by a brilliant young sociologist at the time. And in those interviews, he notes actually that the profile of Egyptian leftists and Egyptian Islamists is very similar, but he also points out and or uses their words to show how for the Islamists, life is just much easier. Their task in
Sure.
terms of recruitment and mobilization is much easier. And he has the communists complaining, and the far left socialists, that first they have to sort of deprogram people from what they see as reactionary religious beliefs, and then reprogram them with atheistic left-wing beliefs. Whereas the Islamists have already got all that social
The foundation's there, right?
exactly, all that social foundation is there for them. So it's just much easier to bring people on board, to convince them. It feels much more Egyptian and much more Arab, much more Muslim. And this is at a time when societies in the Middle East are inundated for the first time, really, with Western ideas and culture. I mean, not for the first time, obviously, it starts in the 19th century, but in terms of mass Western
Right.
culture,
Right.
you mentioned TV. I mean, by the mid 70s in Egypt, something like a third to a half of programming on national TV is American made films and soap
Right.
operas.
Right.
So Dallas is huge.
Right.
And, uh, that obviously puts a lot of backs up among the more conservative elements, young and old, in Egypt. So you have this big question over Western culture coming in such a massive wave. And then you have Islamism offering both local identity, authentic local pride, if you like, and a transformative program. And
Right.
left finds it very difficult
Right.
to compete with
Compete
that.
with that. Right. Exactly. So let me, we're approaching the end here. Last two questions, and this is intellectually dangerous to ask this, but tell me, elevator pitch, pithy takeaway after you've done this research, and then when you look at contemporary Islamic extremism in whatever form, in the Sahel and elsewhere, what's a learning? How has it changed? How has the book changed how you look at contemporary religious extremism in particular?
The first thing it's done is it's moved the origins of what I thought I was looking at back a couple of decades. So the origins of Islamic militancy, contemporary version, Al Qaeda and ISIS and so forth, have always been said to be in the 80s, which is true to a certain extent, but only if you look in a quite narrow way. Really, it's the 60s. The second thing that struck me was how Islamism is a revolutionary project, much as a leftist revolutionary project. And I hadn't really thought that through in the same way. And I think the other element that really kind of grabbed me is that you can only consider any kind of radicalism in the much broader context. So that there's a lot of work that I did in the book on the Cold War and the broader cultural and political context at the time. And without that, you can't understand what's going on. I couldn't understand
Sure.
the kind of broader roots of what happened in the regional politics and so forth of the Middle East. And finally, I think it just came down to the individuals, which is why I spend so much time talking about them. I mean, you mentioned bin Laden. He was a child of the 70s. I mean, that never really occurred to me
Right.
before.
Right.
And that if I was looking at the prehistory of Al Qaeda and ISIS and everything that we had in the teens, or indeed Hamas, who come in at the end of the book. If you want to understand all those movements, if you want to understand October the 7th, 2023, and what happened then, if you want to understand what's happening in current politics in much of the Middle East, certainly in Iran, then the only place to start is the 1970s.
Fantastic. All right. Last question, my friend. We always ask everyone this, and it's always a loaded question, right? Because we're talking about subjects that have shelves and shelves of books written about them. But what are 1 to 2 books that you would point to? If someone who finishes this up and says that this was a brilliant book, but I want to know more, what are 1 or 2 books that should be on
All
the
right, I'm going to
nightstand?
probably do more than one or two. I'm just turning around to look at hundreds on my shelves. But okay, so one of the books that I found was amazing was a book called The Mantle of the Prophet by Roy Maltahede. It came out a couple of decades ago, but it's a reconstruction of the life and thought from the inside of an Iranian Islamic scholar, young cleric. And I learned more about Iran from that
Sure.
than anything else.
Mantle of the Prophet. Wonderful.
Yeah. Now, there is a great book on the broader Cold War politics called The Cold War's Killing Fields by Paul Thomas Chamberlain, who is a US-based academic. That's fantastic. Really worth reading would be Jihad by Gilles Kepel, the French academic. These are all very academic-y. They're all great reads broadly about. I'm looking at the kind of broad ones that are approachable as well. The single best book I've read on the Israel-Palestine conflict and question is Ian Black, Enemies and Neighbors.
I would love to peruse your bookshelf myself. I'm sure there are many
Yeah, I'd
things
like
that I
to.
could tuck
I
away.
can see yours behind you. I'd like to peruse yours.
My wife would love you to peruse it and then take some with you. Well,
Will do, yeah.
Jason, this has been wonderful. Again, as always with these conversations, they can go on for another hour. But the book is The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s by Jason Burke. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Todd.